Athertonville, Kentucky.
Oh.
And they would put on the head of a whiskey barrel, a hog, and they would paint and pull it back, and that would have a stencil. I guess a stencil is what you would call it. So.
Okay.
All right.
About that. I just did.
All right.
We've already started moving. When we moved that picture that was usually there,
yeah, we did we're moving, and like I said, our house is a lot of where pictures are hanging. You got nails and things, but Melinda's putting something up here to make it more attractive.
I'm going to take that plastic fish.
It's a cool plastic fish. We got it in England years ago. Fish and chips. It's Place, which is the good stuff. Anyway, but she's moving that, which I'm very sorry.
It's really bad.
I always get a little embarrassed when I know people can see what a disaster my office actually is.
Oh, no. That's a good office. You should have seen mine. It was at work. I mean, it was just, and of course I got when I was in the first grade, I got the Mr. Messy Desk Award. I'm going to be consistent about that.
I read some article about how like a messy desk is actually like a sign of genius or something like that. Yes, going with it.
So well, that's good to know. That's good to know. I'm happy to hear that.
I was trashed at work for my office.
Yeah.
Let me check the time here. How we doing? Let's see. All right.
I'll hopefully get a pretty good group here today. I'd like to hear a lot of input.
Yeah, I hope so too, certainly. I see several staff from KHS have joined us. I appreciate that.
Oh, good.
Coming in, guys. And let's see. Oh, wait, I didn't mean to change that screen there. Let's see if anybody's posting in the chat.
I'm not going to touch this thing.
Bosco says, cluttered desk, active mind. Empty desk, empty mind. Something like that.
I agree with that.
Yes, I like that.
I agree with that. Okay. Yeah.
I'm gonna pop out for a minute.
Okay. Let's see. Time.
Are most of your staffers still working from home?
It's kind of been a hybrid. We did have to close for several weeks in the spring, and then for a while we were at 50% capacity in the building. We had been able to go up to 75%, but I think starting next week we have to go back to 50% capacity since
it's bad down here.
Yeah.
I think Grace County is one of the red counties, or whatever they call them.
I think Franklin is still orange, but we're surrounded by red. So
well, we're red, and we haven't eaten out since February. We do a lot of takeout, and we mask and we social distance, and we have hand sanitizer because I'm 70, almost 70. My wife is 64, and we're certainly in that age group. You want to get that stand? I could put that right there and look at these notes.
We are at 12 o'clock, so I am going to go ahead and get us started here. Stop sharing my screen there. Hi there, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. Lovely to see all of you. Hope that you are not stressing too bad and checking your phone that often for news. But welcome to First Friday. I'm very happy to have Mr. Barry Craig with us today. He is going to be sharing from his new book, Kentuckians at Pearl Harbor, Stories from the Day of Infamy. And I am excited to hear about that. Just a few reminders before we get rolling. Just remember, please keep your microphones on mute throughout the presentation today. Please feel free to use the chat feature throughout to post questions, comments, whatever. We'll save those for the end, but I will be glad to communicate your question to Mr. Craig. Feel free to keep your camera on though, if you would like to. Just remember we can see you. And then, yeah, we'll save any questions for the end, and hopefully there will be lots of them for him. He and I were discussing earlier that December 7th, of course, is the Day of Infamy, but it's a special day for him for several reasons, which he might share with you. And those of you that work with me at KHS know that I got married on December 7th last year. So it's an important day for me as well. Memorable for many reasons. But to tell you a little bit about him, Barry's coming to us today from Mayfield, Kentucky. And he has been, he's professor emeritus at the Western Kentucky Community and Technical College, where he was a history teacher for many years. And he's written numerous books on Kentucky history. This one being his 9th book that he's just published. And he's also a journalist. I will bet that some of you have read his twice monthly column that was published between, I think, 1989 and 2008, Kentucky Backroads, which was appeared in daily newspapers all over the Commonwealth, dealt with history and politics, that sort of thing. So I'm sure some of you had the chance to read that over the years. He's also written book reviews for the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, as well as the Ohio Valley History, which is the Filson Club publication, and is the recipient of several teaching awards as well. And we're very blessed to have him with us today. So please feel free to submit your questions as he is speaking. Thank you for being here, Mr. Craig. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm amazed at this Zoom thing. As we were talking earlier, I go back to manual typewriters, and you know, when I was a youngster, social media was what a bunch of reporters did at a bar after the paper was put down for the day. Anyway, yes, December 7th is a special day for me. I was born on December the 7th, 1949, and as we were talking earlier, December the 7th postponed one of my dad's careers and canceled another one. On December the 7th, 1941, my dad was a junior in Knoxville, Tennessee, in high school, and had signed a contract with the old St. Louis Browns to pitch in the minor leagues starting the next year. Pearl Harbor came on, he enlisted the Navy, and didn't touch a baseball for another 4 years. He, after he was out of baseball, he was going to Murray State in 1949 on the GI Bill. I was born, and that was the end of his career there. Of the 9 books I've written, this one by far was the most enjoyable, the most interesting. I was able to interview maybe a dozen Pearl Harbor survivors. Sad to say they're all gone. But what's amazing is that the events of that day were indelibly etched into their minds. These fellows could tell you to the minute how they went through this. I was inspired by a book I read when I was in about the 8th grade called Day of Infamy by Walter Lord, in which he interviewed many Pearl Harbor survivors, Japanese and Americans, as well as civilians. And he began by saying that nearly every American alive at the time can describe how he first heard the news. He marked the moment carefully, carving out a sort of mental souvenir, for instinctively he knew how much his life would be changed by what was happening in Hawaii. The first Pearl Harbor survivor interviewed was a man named Allard Vessels of Paducah, where I taught for many years and wrote for the newspaper. He was aboard the Arizona, which I'm sure your listeners know was the most iconic of the warships that were sunk on the date that President Roosevelt called the Day of Infamy. He visited Pearl Harbor many years afterwards and went aboard the Arizona. If you've been to Hawaii, and a lot of people have, there's a memorial. It's a white structure that straddles the ship. It doesn't touch the ship, but it straddles the ship. And you can look out and see the outline of the ship. And oil still seeps up from the ship. It's called the Tears of the Arizona. And he was looking for a name, and he found it. The name of a man, his name was Rothworth Lightfoot. They were playing cards on the day the ship was bombed. Lightfoot didn't make it. And so he is in my book. The air raid alarm is sounded about 5 minutes to 8 on a Sunday morning, and most sailors and soldiers had the day off. It was a Sunday, and it was peacetime. And so there's a ceremony aboard large ships called morning colors, in which the stars and stripes is ceremoniously raised on the fantail of the ship. And the larger ships have bands. The Arizona had a famous band. And they would play the Star Spangled Banner, and when the Star Spangled Banner was finished, then the colors were raised. The band director was a man named Frederick William McKinney. He was a Kentuckian. So was a drummer named Emmett Isaac Lynch. Now, the musicians were ammunition passers down below deck. So when the general quarters battle stations alarm went off, they went below decks to pass ammunition. When the ship blew up, they were all killed. Very few bodies even recovered. Vessels went the other way. The Arizona had two masts, the foremast, the main mast. The main mast at the very top was a machine gun position. And that's where his battle station was. That's 90 feet above the water. So try to imagine today, I mean, hoofing up 90 feet up ladders, outside ladders to the top of this thing. They were vessels was very perturbed why the Army Air Force insisted on having a drill so early on a Sunday morning, messed up his card game, messed up his liberty. So up he goes. Now, before the war in the tropics, the Navy wore short pants. So try to imagine a uniform consisting of black shoes, white socks up to the knee, short pants, and a white t-shirt and a white hat, and with a life jacket. So he goes hoofing it up this thing under fire. Now try to imagine climbing 90 feet up outside ladders with strafing fire pinging all around you, guys getting shot off these ladders. So they get to the top. And again, this is peacetime. And in peacetime, ammunition is kept under lock and key for obvious reasons. They've got 250 caliber machine guns, anti-aircraft guns, and the planes are coming in lower than them. And so he said the first torpedo bombers that came in, they would aim at them and they would take evasive action until they figured out there was no ammunition. When the ship exploded, that's where he was. This massive explosion, which just, it lifted the battleship about 30 feet out of the water, if you could imagine that. This massive ship. He survived because the explosion went forward, the blast, and not to the rear. Nonetheless, the concussion tore all of his clothes off except his skivvy shorts. So he and these other guys are all alive, and they're sitting at the bottom of this thing, this gun position, with nothing on but their skivvy shorts. They had no idea what had happened. They peered out, they looked toward the front of the ship. It was gone, absolutely gone. Flame, smoke, horrible carnage everywhere. They began to climb down. Now on the Arizona, on the main mast is a searchlight deck, large, huge, multi-candle power searchlights. And that's where he saw the first dead body. It was an officer. He said he had binoculars around his neck. He was lying flat on his face. And he said the heat had curled the soles of his shoes off. Down to the deck they went and left the ship. An absolute just carnage beyond belief. That was his survival story. He went back to Paducah after the war, worked for the Colonial Bread Company, died sadly at a very young age. The second fellow I interviewed was a man from Lone Oak, which is a Paducah suburb, some of your listeners may know, named Jimmy Hamlet. And when I heard about him, he was on the USS California. By the way, that ship was called the Prune Barge because the state of California sent them an unending supply of prunes. They were the most regular sailors in the Navy, no doubt. Anyway, so he asked me, when I first seen him, he said, "Do you know anybody who's ever read his own obituary?" I said, "No, I can't say that I have." He said, "Take a look at this." And he showed me from the Harlan Advertiser a report of his death, that Jimmy Hamlin, the reporter that we all loved before he joined the Navy, was killed in action in Pearl Harbor. He then showed me a telegram, which his father received, saying, "We regret to inform you that your son has been lost in action." Then he showed me another telegram that says, "Oops," well, not really oops, but it says, "We're happy to inform you he's alive." Now, this is what, again, we all look at things through our current vision. Now, how could that have happened in the 21st century? He could have got on a cell phone and said, "Hey, Dad, I'm okay. You've read about this. You've seen this on the news, I'm okay." He couldn't. When the ship, the California sank, as did most of the battleships on Battleship Row, and he got off. And when the USS Chicago, a cruiser, came into Pearl Harbor, he volunteered to go out with that cruiser. So when they started counting up names looking for people. He wasn't there. They assumed he was entombed inside the ship. So you can imagine how shocked he was. He told me when he was called in by his division officer aboard the Chicago, said, Hamlin said, you're dead. He said, I beg your pardon. He said, no, he said, please be calm. But he said, the Navy has sent a telegram to your dad that you were killed in an accident at Pearl Harbor, but they'll correct it. And they did. And they did. That was incredible. That happened quite often at Pearl Harbor. There was one case, it's in my book, about a fellow who was reported dead, then reported alive, and then reported dead again. It was mass confusion. Again, you're talking, this is 1941. We don't have this instant communication. Amazing stories. A fellow named J.C. Riley from over in Marshall County was going to play baseball. He had a baseball game scheduled that day. And so he had bought him a brand new Louisville Slugger bat and was on the Fantailist destroyer taking practice cuts when the attack came. He said, I never knew what became my baseball bat, but my shipmate said I threw it at the planes. That was a story. Fellow from Mayfield here. In fact, I used to eat his restaurant. Joe Sanders was on the USS St. Louis. He was going to, he and a buddy were going to rent a camera. You know, you could do that, but he was going to rent a camera and go up into the hills and take pictures. Needless to say, he didn't, his photo shoot was called off. Again, the stories were absolutely incredible. There was a soldier from Owensboro who was a dental technician. And when the attack started, he fell in, strapped on his helmet. And that was the old British style helmet back then, the flat head, the tin pot helmet. And he is running to the hospital and his helmet fell off. And right at that moment, they were strafed and the man in front of him was hit. It would have killed him. This poor fellow later on had what we would call a PTSD, but the trauma of it was another story. Of course, remember Pearl Harbor became a battle cry, like remember the Alamo, remember Pearl Harbor, or remember Fort Sumter. There's a very famous song about Pearl Harbor called "Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition." You maybe could play it if you had it. But anyway, I'd always heard that this song had a connection to Murray, Kentucky. And it does. The man who, well, let me give you a little background. It was Sunday morning, and of course, obviously, church services were not going to be taking place. And so the USS New Orleans, a cruiser, the chaplain was Hal Forgy. And a chaplain cannot, under the Geneva Convention, touch ammunition, cannot load a gun, cannot fire a gun. He's there to give spiritual guidance, which is what he did. And so as he was encouraging his shipmates, one of them said something, well, it's Sunday. And he said, well, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. Well, that got out and it became a famous song. But in the song, he puts down his Bible and fires a gun. Got him in huge trouble with the Navy for doing that. It was absolutely untrue. He didn't do it, but he left to go overseas, or left to join the Navy from the First Presbyterian Church in Murray. And his pictures hang on the wall among pastors. I would recommend to your listeners, viewers, that you get the book. He wrote a book called "And Pass the Ammunition" with help from a journalist. It is the most detailed account of the Pearl Harbor attack. I bet your library's got it that you ever read. And he says he woke up that morning. He said it's a beautiful city. He stared at a porthole and saw a sky of Maxwell Parish blue. That's good stuff. Now, whether he did that or the journalist, I don't know. But he was thinking about Murray. He said he was thinking about Murray, thinking about old Mr. So-and-so and his car and his wife with her tomato relish and all this kind of stuff. Fascinating story. That's when the ship lurched. He didn't know what it was. The next thing you know, they're under attack. On the USS Raleigh, a cruiser, was a fellow from Hopkinsville who was literally caught with his trousers down. He was in the head or the toilet, and he was doing his business when a torpedo hit the ship, plowed through their church launch, hit the ship and exploded. It raised him about 1.5 feet off the toilet and back down he went. And he said to me, I wasn't very salty back then. I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe the ship just did this from time to time. That was a weird story. I mean, these stories are absolutely incredible. And I was so blessed to talk to these fellows. A lot of them mistook the Japanese planes for American planes. See, back then, the insignia on American aircraft was a blue circle with a white star and a red dot in the middle. Well, when they saw that red dot, they said, well, that's just the red team. They put that on there for these exercises. And it didn't take them long to figure out what this was. It's at this, again, the story, the amazing stories. And there were civilians too. There's also a chapter in my book. How are we doing on time, by the way? We okay? Oh, good. Sometimes you get really cranked up on this stuff. My wife always says, don't go into your lecture mode. I can't help it. I did 24 years of this. But there were civilians. There was also a tremendous account that I ran across of a man who worked for it. They were volunteers that worked with the Army Air Force. Back then, there was no Air Force. It was part of the Army. It was the Army Air Force. Tremendous account of the attack that he wrote. Fantastic. I found that in an old Georgetown paper. There were a number of, well, one of the stories was a man from Mayfield named Louis Saxon. In 1941, there were very few opportunities for African Americans in the armed forces. The Marines wouldn't allow blacks to serve. In the Navy, they were cooks or mess attendants. In the Army, they were cooks. I found very few African Americans from Kentucky who were at Pearl Harbor. Louis Saxton was one, a very small man. He was a cook at Schofield Barracks. And so when the attack came, he, like everybody else, had no idea what this was. A very small man, but there are big ovens in the kitchen or there. And he climbed inside an oven, not on, of course, and wrote out the attack in this big oven. Again, amazing, amazing, amazing stories. Another man from Mayfield named Tommy Lewis, he talked about having to bury the dead. He said that the ordnance was supposed to do this. He was an airplane mechanic, but he said we all pitched in to help. Just burying the dead. Just complete shock and horror at this. A lot of these guys who were in the service then were not long-time careerists. A lot of them joined because the Depression was still hanging on. Jimmy Hamlin told me that he went to Louisville to sign up. He lived in Harlan then. And you're supposed to write an application, why are you joining the Navy? And he wrote, I want to eat. And he said that this chief officer stood up and read it out to the other recruits. And he said, they all started laughing. He said, don't laugh. You're here for the same reason I am. 3 hots and a flop, is my dad, the sailor, used to say. 3 meals a day and a place to bed down. So a lot of these folks, and a lot of them too, had never been out of Kentucky. And of course, Hawaii was just exotic. Their letters are amazing about this place, how fantastic it is. I mean, the weather is gorgeous. You can go swimming on Christmas Day. Just this tropical paradise, nothing like Kentucky at all. There were also several letters about, well, one fellow wrote in, that wrote home, said, well, World War II, of course, it started in September of 1939. And this sailor, presumably this sailor, wrote a letter to the editor of the Courier Journal in which he said, we have no fear of war here. The Japanese would never attack this place. They couldn't get here. That was the prevailing opinion of the American military and civilian, Admiral Kimmel and General Short. Kimmel was from Henderson and was blamed for the Pearl Harbor debacle. I didn't get into that in my book. I'll leave that to the historians to discuss. But this fellow, Kimmel, according to the story, when the attack began, he went to his office on the shore, and a fragment from a shell hit him. And he said, I wish it had killed me because I know my career is over with this. But civilian back in Kentucky, I found this amusing. At the time, I'm sure it wasn't. But as we talked before, in Frankfurt, there was an air raid drill right after Pearl Harbor, an air raid drill. Now, I don't know how far it is mileage from Tokyo to Frankfurt or from Berlin to Frankfurt, but I dare say that for a Japanese or a German plane to get to Frankfurt, you have to refuel several times, including in the United States. Nonetheless, they had this air raid drill. And they didn't have a proper air raid siren, so they used an old steamboat whistle. And they put it atop a building in town. I never could figure out, never heard which building it was. So they had this air raid drill. Well, the Frankfurters, or whatever you call folks live up there, Frankfurters, I guess, they sort of made it as a joke. They had air raid wardens running around shooing people into buildings. There was one funny story about this preacher, this teetotaling preacher ducked into a liquor store. That was funny, they thought. But the most bizarre, next to the air raid siren, was that everyone went into the stores and stood inside the windows, which is absolutely suicidal. The Londoners could tell you that's not the place to be in an air raid alert. There were guards placed on bridges around the state that were, as in case, there was a great fear that saboteurs would use rural airports in Kentucky. There was a law was passed that sabotage, you could be put to death for that. Well, the first case of sabotage in Kentucky was not carried out by an enemy alien. It was put out by this guy who had to work on Christmas Eve. And he was very upset about that. He was drunk, and he threw some metal into machinery to stop the machinery so he could go home. He was convicted of that. He only got a short prison sentence for it, but that's the sabotage there was. Again, it's amazing too how Kentuckians just pitched in. Democrat, Republican, all that was forgotten to join the war. Editorials in the paper. Some of them were measured, and until others were just blatantly racist, blatantly xenophobic. But there was incredible unity among the people. The news was received in Kentucky via radio. And there weren't that many radios. I mean, a lot of rural parts of Kentucky in the 1941 did not have electricity, maybe 1 in 10 farms. And they would gather around radios. The Courier Journal put an extra, you see, extra, read all about it. Well, that's what that was. The Paducah Sun Democrat, where I worked for many years, had an extra. The editor, one of the editors, just happened to be in the building because he'd forgotten something. The phone rings, and this man says, "Ed, the Japanese are bombing Pearl Harbor." He said, "What?" Next thing you know, the AP wire starts to rattle. And so they decided to call the staff in and put out a paper. Well, Joe Lagore, one of the editors, had been in World War I, been in the trenches. So his job is to try to round up people. Well, there was a reporter named Mitchell, and they tried to find him. Well, they discovered he was taking a flying lesson in a plane without a radio. So Joe drives out this little airstrip and waits for him to come down. His brother was at Pearl Harbor and survived. He was in the Army Air Force. Amazing stories. This one fellow, young fellow, was a carrier. He was awakened early that morning from a man from the paper, and they had a Paul Revere ride through Ballard County, extra, selling the paper as they rode through the county. It was amazing. There was an enormous rush of volunteers to join that very day. They knocked the doors off the recruiting office in Louisville. All over the state, men volunteered to go. A lot of them were World War I vets who were too old to go. There was one fella in Louisville who was a World War I vet, and he couldn't go, so he went and volunteered to be a volunteer firefighter for the Louisville Fire Department, an aide or something. So there was tremendous support for this. And the thing about World War II, if you study, it is the only war this nation's ever fought in which the population was well nigh unanimous in support. Go back to the Revolutionary War. A lot of Americans were on the British side. He's telling my students, those who are trying to get in the DAR, you better watch how you shake that family tree, because a patriot falls off one limb and a Tory on the other. The War of 1812 had massive opposition. The Mexican-American War, opposition. Civil War, that's obvious. World War I in opposition. The Korean War, Vietnam, the Middle East, all these were divided conflicts, not World War II. Everybody to do their part, and Kentuckians certainly were among them. But again, this was absolutely going back to Hawaii to see these places. I had a wonderful old professor named Roy Hatt at Murray State. And he said, I taught for years about Jamestown. I'd never been. But once I went there, I thought, whew, it's exactly the way I talked about it. But when you go there and you see this place, the irony too, as we landed at Daniel Inouye International Airport, which is next door to Wheeler Field, the Army Air Force Base. JAL, Japanese airline planes were there. Japanese tourists all over the place. We went out to this, I can't pronounce, Cana Point or something, beautiful hike out to where the albatrosses are. And on the way back, we met this Japanese couple who were about our age. And they asked how far it was. We said, not too far. And I thought to myself, were their parents, were their grandfathers soldiers, sailors, the Japanese Army, military, like ours? Because we're the same age. But the irony of that was just so incredible about how times have changed. But again, going there, taking the launch out to the Arizona and seeing it where this took place, the battleships were along what's called Battleship Row, which adjoins Ford Island in the middle of Pearl Harbor. And if you go there, there's wonderful museums there, air museums, as all kinds of airplanes. And they preserved the bullet holes in the glass. You can still see it. And you go out and you look at the runways. It's no longer an airfield, but it was. You can still see the pock marks. Daniel Martinez took us over to where the Navy had a seaplane base on Fort Island, and you can see these pock marks in the concrete from cannon shells, from bullets hitting. One of the most tragic stories about Pearl Harbor dealt with a young ensign from Louisville named Herbert Hugo Minges. On the night of December the 7th, so there were some American fighter planes, Navy planes that tried to land on Fort Island, and they were shot at, friendly fire. He was killed. His plane crashed into a famous bar called Palm Lodge in Pearl City, which is near Pearl Harbor. He was burned to death. And what's interesting is the Navy never said what happened to him until after the war. I don't know when his parents discovered what happened to him. They just simply said he was killed at Pearl Harbor, but it was friendly fire. Of course, that would be demoralizing, obviously, to know. And Daniel Martinez took us out to the place where his plane crashed. Another very tragic story was a man named Robert Leopold from Louisville, who was an ensign on the Arizona. As a tragic series of letters the Filson Club has that taught his parents were trying desperately to find his body, and they never did. A lot of the battleship Oklahoma capsized. About 500 men were lost. And when the ship was finally righted, they found remains, mostly not bodies, and they were buried in the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Honolulu. Well, along came something called DNA, and they've been able to identify the remains of several Kentuckians, including from all over the state. So the remains are being identified with DNA, which is remarkable. All these years later, and they're bringing these guys home in these very ceremonial burials, including one in Madisonville. This young fellow was an ensign. His name was Bailey Pride. He was brought home and was put in the family cemetery with his parents. So what I'm saying is, and I said in my book, Pearl Harbor is still reverberating in this state, because every once in a while you'll pick up a paper, turn on the TV, and you'll see another Oklahoma casualty has been brought home. Their names are in the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Honolulu. It's called the Guards of the Remembrance, and it's got the names. And when they do identify them, they put a little rosette, little bronze rosette to show they've been identified. A lot of them still haven't. On the Arizona, most of those men are still entombed in the ship. It's a grave. You can't go around it. It's a war grave. About 1,000 or so are in there. Very, very moving to see this. And I think it's even more, and I get really emotional about this. My dad, God rest his soul, and my father-in-law, they were part of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. We're here because of what they did. Not just Americans, British, Free French, Russians, New Zealanders, Australians were all part of this that saved the world. And this is I guess I'm about out of time. My wife says, got to do this, After I wrote a story about Jimmy Hamlin, he came into the newsroom and brought me a fruit cake, those little fruit cakes, and said, "Thank you for telling my story." And I said, "No, sir. Thank you for letting me tell your story." I think I hit my spot. We're okay, right?
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm really excited to get a copy of your book. It sounds
Well, thank you.
fascinating.
And I
Absolutely.
will let me also make the offer to you that I made to you before we went on the air. Those who want this book autographed, I always add this to purchasers. I will sign it unless you think it will decrease the yard sale value. Then we'll leave it off.
We are going to have some signed copies at the KHS gift store if you would like to get one of the signed copies. So we do have some questions that folks have submitted through the chat here. So I'll start there. Let's see. Todd wanted to know, do you know like roughly how many Kentuckians were at Pearl Harbor altogether?
Unfortunately, I do not. Those records are just about impossible. I would say more than you would think. Because I thought of, think Kentucky is a landlocked state. You would think that a lot of the Navy guys came from Massachusetts or some coastal area, but more than you would think. That's all I can add. But no, I have no idea.
So Dennis wanted to find out what was the largest number of Kentuckians from any one part or city of Kentucky?
Another excellent question. I would guess, I don't know the answer. I would guess Louisville because it's the biggest city, although they're from everywhere. I mean, from little tiny hamlets in Eastern Kentucky, Western Kentucky. But based on our research, I'd have to say Louisville, again, for the simple reason it's the largest town in the state.
Most people there. Okay. And he also wanted to know, how did you get these Kentuckians to talk about their experiences? And he says, my father, who enlisted the week after Pearl Harbor, did not talk much about the war.
That's an excellent question. I did a number of interviews on World War II veterans when they were older. My dad, who was shot at a fair bit of times, mostly talked about, well, he was 18 years old. Now, wife says I can't tell the story, so I won't anyway. But he was 18 years old, single. And as he said, I joined the Navy and see the world, it was said. He said, I joined the Navy, let the world see me. He was 18 years old. He had a lot of fun off duty. So that's one perspective. He never talked a whole lot about the bad stuff. That's a very good question. And it kind of relates. These fellows were older at the time, and they were quite willing to talk. I never met any of them that wouldn't talk about it. I mean, they were, but on the other hand, I understand what he's saying. Because a case in point was a dear friend of mine, one of my Union friends, was a gunner on the B-17, was shot down. He was in a raid on Schweinfurt, Germany, where they shot 60 B-17s down. And when I interviewed him, his son said, "This is amazing. Dad would never talk about any of this, but I got him." My Sunday school teacher at the Presbyterian Church in Mayfield was said to be the first American to set foot in Germany in World War II. Won 5 silver stars. And he would talk about it until he was almost dead. I think a lot of these guys toward the end of their lives wanted to get it out. And I know a lot of guys wouldn't, but interesting, all the ones I talked to were freely open. That they talked at length about it. But I do know, I understand what he's saying. Yes, a lot of these fellows wouldn't talk about it, because I have talked to other people since his book came out and said, yeah, I said my dad was here or there, and he wouldn't talk about it. And I understand that.
Yeah.
Fully.
So let's see. We have Griffin is with us today. Griffin is 9 years old, and he has a couple of questions. How many people survived the attack of the Arizona, and did other ships sink during the attack? Do you know how many?
I don't have my book handy. Over 1,000 were killed in the Arizona. Of course, there were some guys ashore, but very, very few. In fact, most of the casualties at Pearl Harbor were aboard the Arizona. That's the biggest single death loss. Then about 500 perished on the Oklahoma, which was capsized. It was torpedoed and capsized. And Jimmy Hamlin said when he came up out of the California to abandon ship, he said that I thought I was looking at the biggest submarine I ever saw in my life. That was the bottom of the Oklahoma where it had capsized. Most of the, now you have to understand too, that the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese also, they understood that for this to be successful, they had to have air superiority. So they went after the air bases, Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, the Navy bases. But the majority, and I would encourage this young man to get a copy of a book called Day of Infamy by Walter Lord, if he's interested. He has got casualty numbers in the back of the book. I do have them in my book. I can't remember them offhand, but just a few hundred on the Arizona survived. And again, most of them were killed. Their bodies were never recovered. That's a good question, though.
Did other ships sink during the attack?
Oh, yes, lots and lots of ships. On Battleship Row, well, what you have is you had these ships, they were paired up. They were tied up inboard. The California sank, the West Virginia, they were all heavily damaged. The Nevada, I got to remember, it's Nevada, not Nevada, Nevada. The USS Nevada attempted to escape. And it steamed out. It was swarmed on, bombed, torn to pieces, and it was run aground to keep from blocking the harbor. Yes, many, many ships were sunk or damaged. However, the interesting thing about this is most of them were repaired and got back into action, which astonished the Japanese how fast they did this. Now, Jimmy Hamlin went aboard the USS Chicago, which is heavily damaged in action. Then he wound up on a troop transport, and he said that in one of the battles late in the war, he said he saw the California, and he said he cried, and he kept yelling, "Go get them, Pruden Barnes, go get them." These ships were amazingly, the only ones that were lost were the Oklahoma. It was damaged beyond repair. The Arizona, and the old target tug, the USS Utah, target ship. But it was amazing how fast. Some were undamaged relatively. For example, the New Orleans was in dry dock, and they couldn't hit it. Their only danger was a bomb, and a bomb there was tied up next to them was a cargo ship filled with thousands and thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline, and a bomb barely missed it. If it hit that ship, it would have been an explosion. There's a famous photo, by the way, of the USS Shaw, a destroyer that exploded in just enormous fireball. The photographer who took that picture was from Carlisle County in Western Kentucky. He didn't get credit because it was a U.S. Navy photo, but yes. But I would suggest he get that book. It'll give you detailed of how many ships were lost, how many people were lost. Yeah, but there were a lot. The Pacific Fleet was heavily, heavily damaged, but it was astonishing how fast. Now, the Japanese admiral that planned the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Yamamoto, which I'm sure is terrible Japanese pronunciation, but anyway, he told the Japanese warlord, the Japanese government, "I can pull this off. I can do it." But 6 months later, I got nothing to say. 6 months after Pearl Harbor is the Battle of Midway, where the United States sank 4 of the carriers that were at Pearl Harbor. That was the turning point of the war. Yamamoto didn't live to say, "I told you so," because they shot him down and killed him later. But he warned the Japanese, this is a big mistake, a big mistake. Did it anyway.
Megan would like to know what she said there. What is the name of the sailor from Mayfield that you mentioned?
Oh, Joe Sanders was one. He was one of several. VC Kidd was another fella. Joe Sanders, if Megan knows Mayfield, she may know Joe and Claudine's restaurant. Excellent driving, great cheeseburgers that he ran for years. And that's another thing too, was fascinating. After going through this, these guys just went home and took up their business. My father-in-law was a storekeeper in Arlington, Kentucky. He went back to his dad's store. My dad went back to play baseball. Bill Hack, the bomber crewman, went back as an iron worker. It was like they wanted to get on with their lives. And I think that's another reason they didn't want to talk about it, was because there was a fellow, in fact, we live in his house, was a fellow named Dan Garrett, who won a Silver Star and a French Croix de Guerre in Europe. And he said, "I'm not a hero." He said, "Everybody who did anything in the war, I don't care if you were never sent outside the United States, you're a hero. You did part of this too." And a lot of these guys, and Frank Cobb, the fellow who won the Silver Stars, he said, "We didn't talk about this because everybody was doing something. And we wanted to get on with their lives." And they did. And again, most of these sailors, some of them stayed in the Navy or in the Army, but most of them they just enlisted, and after the war was over, they got out.
And also, Megan Willett is her name, and she said, "Also, would you tell your wife hello for me?"
Megan Willett.
That's Sammy Willett's daughter. Yeah.
It's Sammy Willett's daughter, son of a gun. Willett. Now that Willett is a fancy farm name. It's one of the first families of fancy farm of the Willets.
Ah, okay.
There you go.
Griffin is her son that was asking about the question about the Arizona. Marvin is asking, do you have a chapter in your book on the USS Oklahoma?
Yes, there's a chapter in the book. I had the Oklahoma and the Arizona together in one chapter. Yes, and there were a number of Kentuckians on both those ships. What I did, I broke it down into chapters where the Navy. I talked about the battleships, and of course, that Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia. There's a sailor. There's a chapter on the cruisers. A chapter of what my dad called the Dungaree Navy. Now, the Dungaree Navy is an old Navy term. It's for support ships. They would be repair ships, would be tankers, oilers, or in his case, landing crafts. They call them the Dungaree Navy because if you're on a cruiser or battleship, you got to be spick and span, Navy all the way, dress up. My dad's, his uniform on this landing craft, he basically he was in the engine room below decks, and it was quite hot in the Pacific. He would have on a pair of dungarees. He got some marine shoes that he made into sandals, and very, very, and didn't wear a shirt. That's very on a battle wagon or a cruiser. No, you got to be ship shape Navy squared away. So I got a whole chapter on guys who were on these, and they were hit too. They were heavily bombed. Some of these, they were all over the harbor. They were looking for targets for opportunity all over the place. But I did not short shrift the Army or the Army Air Corps, by the Army Air Force. So there's stories about that too.
Well, let's see. I think that is the last question that we had. So if anybody else has anything, please feel free to put that in the chat box. Dennis has. He says, I've read many books about World War II, and you are by far the most interesting author.
Oh, well. Yeah. Well,
thank you for your research and retelling of those stories. I
appreciate that very much. Very much.
So his children and grandchildren can have those stories to read over and over again. And he's very glad that these stories are about Kentuckians. And I too appreciate that.
Well, what I did,
I'd like to see that documented.
When I read Walter Lord's book many years ago, and again, I won't go back to all these interviews I had, and I thought, this might make a book. So I pitched it to the University Press, and they said, okay, and we did it because it's never been talked at a specific state. Maybe there's a book on New Yorkers or Californians, I don't know, but I thought so many of these stories are incredible, and they're typical of folks who were from other states. But again, going back to my initial remarks, I'm amazed. And I know people say, well, what were you doing when 9/11 came up? You remember that. I do. Everybody do. Or what were you doing? The Kennedy assassination, for example, or the Martin Luther King assassination, or the Bobby Kennedy assassination. But these guys, again, they're at peace. One guy said, well, one of my favorite stories was on the California. One fellow said, the Japanese are bombing us. He said, hell, I don't know. They were mad at us. This other fellow from Frankfurt, I heard it, got a great interview with him, oral interview. Same thing he said. He says, why are they tearing up our toys? That's what he said. Why are they tearing up our toys? And it's like, it was a complete stun. It was just totally out of a day. And it was a gorgeous day. Oh, I mean, if you've been to Hawaii, there's no such thing as a bad day in Hawaii. Beautiful, beautiful sunny day. Interestingly, the Uber driver who took us out to Pearl Harbor, we were talking about, he was in his 30s. And he said, my grandmother said that when all this started, that she took my father out and said, oh, look at all the pretty fireworks. She had no idea what it was because she was 10, 12 miles away from Pearl Harbor. And no one expected this. No one expected this. And it's like, and again, I think from a Kentucky perspective, we're sort of an insular state, shall we say, an interior state. What a shock. Now, there was a World War I song called How Are You Going to Keep Them Down on the Farm Once They've Seen Paris? Well, you can say that about World War II. I mean, these guys, after going through this, and for a lot of them, this is the first battle of many, many, many more to come. And you survive this, you think, well, okay. And here comes a lot more after that. It is amazing. But my hat's off to them. These were, when I was 18 years old, I know which end was up. And you know, the Japanese, the Germans say, oh, the Americans are all soft. All they can do is make refrigerators and razor blades. Well, they found out the error of their ways very quickly. And the war production, that's another part about it and about the domestic part of the book is about the war production. The Merritt Clothing Company here in Mayfield, they made overcoats for the Army. My grandmother sewed sleeves and overcoats in that factory. There was an ammunition plant at Viola, Kentucky. All over the state, they switched into war production very quickly. And, you know, in Detroit and Dearborn, Ford Motor Company switched to making bombers just almost overnight. How fast we geared up to do this. And again, this was the most enjoyable book.
Incredible.
Probably my last, but anyway.
Deborah also had a question.
Yes.
She wanted to know, she said, which story was the most challenging to tease out? And what was the most surprising thing you learned while researching this book?
Excellent question. As I said, remarkably, these fellows I talked to were very open with it. So I never had any difficulty. Now, I will tell you this, I hope this isn't too far off the top. Sometimes these stories are hard to find. Again, going back to my bomber crewman friend, named Bill Hack, I was talking to Bill, and Bill Sanders came up. Bill was head of the building trades in Paducah for years. Said, oh yeah, he said I got when I came back from World War II, said I got my first job. I went down to Bill Sanders helped me get my first job. And I said, oh, you were in World War II? Yep. Army Air Force. Did you go overseas? Yep. See any action? A little bit. I said, it's what? He said, I was a gunner on a B-17. I said, how many missions did you fly? He said, 25. First time, 6 the second. And it was like very cryptic answers, trying to pull it out of him. And finally I said, Bill, you talking about this? Yeah, I think I will. And that's how I got him. But the Pearl Harbor guys, and the same with my Sunday school teacher, Frank Cobb. Frank wouldn't talk to me about it either until he was dying of cancer. And he told my dad, he said, your boy's been after me for years to get this story. I'll give it to him. So I called him up and said, Frank, can I talk to you at your earliest convenience, like 1 o'clock this afternoon? He said, come on over. And his son, who's a doctor, was a doctor in Paducah. He said, I can't believe my dad told you all this. He never told me any of it. And I said, I got him at the right time. It's like they want to get this out before it's too late. And sadly, a lot of them died without telling. I had students that told me. I had a kid brought in his granddad's Pearl Harbor, or his granddad's World War II souvenirs, including a big piece of shrapnel. I said, what's the story of this? He says, I don't know. It was just in my granddad's box of stuff. I see that there's a story behind that, but we'll never know. So I always encourage my students, and I would encourage your listeners to interview their grandparents, even if they weren't in World War II. Most of them weren't these days, about what it was like. Get this stuff on record. This is terrific social history, which I'm always been fascinated with. I was much more interested in knowing what ordinary soldiers and sailors and airmen were doing than what the generals were doing. There are plenty of books about the generals and the admirals and the politicians. That's fine. I'm not knocking it. That's fantastic. That's good stuff. But what I want to talk about is what were you doing when the thing happened?
Absolutely. And those interviews, like he's talking about, if you want any assistance or guidance in doing an oral history interview like that, the Kentucky Oral History Commission lives here at the Kentucky Historical Society, and my colleague Sarah is wonderful. And so Sarah Schmidt, she would.
And you guys did a great job of some Pearl Harbor. So right, in fact, you've done all kinds of oral history, and not only Murray State's done it. Eastern's got a good library of this. The oral history stuff is wonderful. Just get a tape.
We are, I think, are the only state that actually has like an appointed oral history.
Really, that's wonderful. Yeah. It's great stuff, and they're fascinating. And that, you know, in history we talk about primary sources. That's as primary as you get. I was there. Yeah. And talking about it, and again, and listen to these fellows. A lot of them, of course, the passage of time, and but again, I had Allard Vessels telling me what time he got out of bed, what he had for breakfast, playing cards, game called AC Deucey, which is a Navy card game. Before it was just amazing. But the shock of this, it's like, well, it'd be like if you're walking down Main Street there in Frankfurt, and all of a sudden planes come and start shooting up the place. Who are these? Why are they doing this?